As the author of books on learning myself, everything from The Victorious Mind to math and numbers and equations, memory books, to fun stuff like the forthcoming Mystery of the Magnetic Numbers for Kids and the Memory Detective series like Flyboy, I've spent a lot of time researching the memory techniques and the learning strategies that I myself use. But what are those books that I have found so impactful as a learner myself? In today's video, I'm going to share with you a bunch of my favorites, why I think they're so great. Some of them you will have heard of before. Others you may be surprised, and I hope that you will enjoy them. And also, if you're really interested in picking the absolute best books on learning that fit you in a tailor-made way, well, we can't exactly work together on that through video, but I've created for you a much more expansive list with a quiz that will help you be able to figure out where you are and then use the results from the quiz to help you pick the best learning books possible for you. And even better, I've made something for you that will help you continue to find learning books once that you have gone through the whole list. So more on how you can access that as we get into my first pick, and this is in no particular order. These are just books that I really like on the topic of how to learn, equip yourself with amazing learning strategies. Let's go. Graham Alcott's How to Be a Knowledge Ninja, I think, is one that everybody would benefit from, partly because it's not really a book just about learning. It's about why that your lizard mind gets in the way, gets in between you and just doing what it takes, because there are reasons. So a lot of this book is about environmental control and physical optimization. So, it's not bereft of learning techniques at all, but rather it's premised on the foundations and the fundamentals of making sure that you actually are in a position to use memory techniques. So you build your kingdom of learning from the ground up. And as it says here, you can study smarter, focus better, and achieve more. I really like this book and highly recommend it. As a standout quote, check this out. The other thing about the lizard brain, which works for any kind of stress, is that if you convince your body that you're not stressed, you can actually reduce your stress. Now, that might sound a little bit strange if you've never tried it, but the reality is that you really can use your mind to reduce stress, and this will help you get into learning. And really, I think this is where the title Knowledge Ninja comes into play, because ninjas have control over their minds. And by the way, ninjas also used memory techniques. He doesn't get into that, but in my more broad and expansive list, I will share with you a book where you can learn about ninja memory techniques. Next up is The Wandering Mind by Jamie Kreiner. I found this book because I was reading her translation of John Cassian, which has been put into a new book called How to Focus. And when I looked at the back and the citations, I was like, wow, I have to read The Wandering Mind. And it is wonderful. Now, this little I here is a very important part of the book, because as Kreiner tells the story, one of the things that monks used to do to help wake themselves up while reading, let's just face it, texts that were a little bit boring, is that they would draw these exaggerated pictures in the books as reminders of waking themselves up, which is an interesting strategy that you could try and model. Will it work for you? I don't know. Do you want to draw in books? I also don't know, but it is an interesting technique, and it reminds me of some of the ways that I use flashcards by drawing pretty strange images. Now, they don't necessarily wake me up or cause me to focus, but I found it interesting amongst many other things that techniques like that go back to the medieval era. So this is a wonderful book. It only has one chapter on memory, but I think that what makes this so outstanding for people to read in our time is to understand that the problems with focus, there's nothing new about it. And the solutions, although a lot of the ones in The Wandering Mind are not things that you want to choose, it will help give you critical thinking about why they're so bad and why some people do so many desperate things in order to, just avoid the fundamentals. And some of those fundamentals are in here. And there's some very cool reflections on Hugh of St. Victor, who is one of the greatest memory masters of all time, and how that he was working on building what you sometimes think of as a infinite memory palace. And one of his books is featured in my more extensive list. But if you can't read the medieval books, this is going to give you a great insight into what they're saying, and then serve as a on-ramp to start reading those books yourself, because they're very, very valuable. You can't actually over-exaggerate just the amount of riches that you're going to experience by finding your way into the source text. So always keep that in mind, that you don't have to try to master reading old books that are hard and challenging. I still find some of those old books hard and challenging. But by reading commentaries on them, you give yourself an on-ramp. And one of the standout quotes from The Wandering Mind for you is really beautiful. "We often blame our memories for blanking, but monks were likelier to accuse theirs of being hyperactive, and this was an additional threat to their attention." I highlight that quote in particular because we often blame the wrong things on what is causing us to lose focus, causing us to forget. So part of the mission, and some of the other books that are going to help you complete this mission, is actually highlighting, narrowing in on, focusing on, laser destroying the real problems. Because a lot of us are just simply not tackling the real issues, and we're coming at it from all the wrong angles. So Wandering Mind, great book. And if you like these kinds of recommendations and you're new here, make sure to get subscribed, hit that thumbs up, and help me boost this video to more people who need more recommendations on books on learning and things like the quiz that I have for you, so that we can all grow together and think deeply about what the real problems are. This is Dr. Anthony Metivier from magneticmerrymethod.com. Thank you for joining me. And, when we think about the real problems that the Wandering Mind monks weren't addressing, let's look in our next book at this notion of real. The Real Work on the Mystery of Mastery by Adam Gopnik. I really like this book. It was recommended to me by a guy I want to give a shout out to named Jamie Ian Swiss. He wrote Preserving Mystery, a really good book on magic and issues in performance and so forth. He's a great skeptic. Anyway, I was talking to him about an idea I had to start a magic theater, and he said, you got to really read The Real Work. And it does have a lot to do with the origin of the term the real work, which comes from the realm of magic. But even if you're not interested in magic, magicians spend a crazy amount of time learning stuff. And what Gopnik does is he dives into all of the different skills and techniques that he never learned. So you get everything from adventures in learning to paint, to drive a car. He never had a driver's license. And it's just amazing, some of the stuff in cooking and so forth. I'm not really interested in some of the things that he decided to go and learn, but he's a good writer, and he pulls out all kinds of angles on what it is to reach mastery and why a lot of us never do. So it'll give you a lot of metacognitive thinking about what learning is. And if you've ever wanted to work towards mastering something, this will be really good reading, because of, to some people, I think this may be a bit too abstract, but I still mention it. Well, maybe my standout quote will help illustrate why. Almost all of our useful knowledge is potential knowledge. That's very, very compelling to me, because the problem that a lot of people have is that they just don't put what they know into action. And so there's a difference between just having stuff that you've thought about or learned about and actually doing the real work. Because when you do the real work, you actually start to think about it in a completely different way. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people lock themselves out of mastery because they're trying to understand what it is that they're supposed to do without just going in and doing the doing. And ultimately, even if it's just as simple as learning how to drive, entire worlds of potential open up for you when you actually do the thing that gets you the skill, that you can't even imagine what they are until that you do it. So it's a really interesting reflection on what learning is from a writer who is definitely very, very skilled. And I like his style a lot, and I think your mileage may vary, but the ideas nonetheless, they kind of require a style like that in order to emerge. Definitely a 10 out of 10 from me. A mind map, writes Tony Buzan, relies on the power of radiant thinking rather than on deduction and reduction. As an open-minded thinking tool, a mind map charts the process of the brain in action instead of fixating on conclusions and outcomes. Well, that is found in Mind Map Mastery by Tony Buzan. It wasn't his last book exactly, but I think it was the most full project that he finished before he went to the Great Memory Palace in the sky. This book is extraordinary to me for lots of reasons, one of which is that he talks about why he abandoned mind maps for better memory, which is something that I took as a baton, which I picked up. But having known Buzan, having used his particular style of mind mapping to help develop the Magnetic Memory Method project that this channel supports and I use as a representative of the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass and so forth, the ideas in this book, especially this idea of radiant thinking, of getting yourself into the process, being physically engaged and using multiple colors and essentially trying to get the process itself to map the way he thought your brain works. This is really, really powerful. So when we talk about the real work and, a lot of people not actually doing the thing so that they never actually can see what it is that they're doing in the fullest possible implications and possibilities and potentials, that's what Buzan was trying to get you to do. And even if he had these ideas that the mind map is like the cell of the brain, even if that's not actually, going to pan out in neuroscience and so forth. The way that the brain works is you have to be using parts of the brain and multiple parts of the brain in order for everything to fire and to help different parts of your brain that may be lying dormant actually explode into action so that you're able to see the world in a different way. So it's a procedural method of learning. And there's lots and lots of different applications for mind mapping. So I really, really highly recommend this book. And I gave you the standout quote already. But if you're not mind mapping, this is a discipline that's well worth getting into. And you can't go wrong by consulting what Tony Buzan had to say about it. My next pick is not a book on learning as such, but I want to mention the story series by Ollie Richards because they essentially, each one, gives you a guide on how to help yourself learn a language through reading. Now, reading is a very, very important part of the big five of language learning, which is reading, writing, speaking, listening, and memorizing. And one of the beauties of reading is that it's a natural form of spaced repetition. The key idea here that a lot of people miss is that you read even without understanding, and you do not stop to look up words. At best, what you do is you make a note in a notebook, as he instructs here, of the words that you want to look up later. But I think that we could add a little bit of finesse, which is to minimize it absolutely to 3 words max per page. So you're not just copying out all the words. You're just going at it with a very, very small amount. And I don't even copy them out in other books. I just use what's called a marginalia dot. And then that helps me find what those words were, but gives me a little bit of a test because I have to look, what was that word on that line, or indeed the phrase on that line that I found so attractive that I wanted to look up later. So it's getting more engagement. Anyway, these are fantastic resources for language learners, and they also give you incredible tips on how to learn a language. Just keep in mind that reading is only part of the big five: reading, writing, speaking, listening, and memorizing. So this is going to be a tremendous resource for the reading part. And Ollie Richards at large will get you into the other bits as well. And I even have a memory palace of his from when I visited him in Cairo, and I was memorizing the hiragana and katakana in Japanese that time. And what a place to memorize them. It was amazing indeed. He's a great guy. So get his short story books if you're a language learner. If we look at learning from a different angle, The Experience Machine by Andy Clark is really, really valuable. See, the problem is that some of us fail to learn because we have predicted how the learning process will go, and then our brains work to fulfill that prediction. So it sounds crazy, but if you tell yourself that it's going to be difficult, your brain will make it true. And if you say other kinds of messages to yourself, and maybe you don't deny reality, you say something more like, man, this is going to be difficult, but I am excited to take action and absolutely conquer this topic. Well, your brain is much more likely to help make that so. Let's look at our standout quote to get into the weeds a little bit more about how all that works. One important and consistent finding is that chronic depression involves a resistance to updating our negative expectations when confronted with what ought to be good evidence of positive outcomes. So that is essentially what I was talking about in The Victorious Mind, and how that I got out of that negative loop. I kept telling one of my therapists, like, that will never work, as if I was the authority. And I somehow needed to keep thinking that I was the authority. So it was like control, seeking to control, over and over and over again. And it was only when finally a message got through that it has to change. You have to have a better thinking model, that I was able to start having a better experience machine. So this book is groundbreaking, especially if you're stuck in a rut. It will teach you more about how that your brain maps out the world and traps you in negative patterns. And there's just so much to say about that from a memory science perspective and so forth. But one of the great things about this is that it uses the example of pain and how we learn to continue feeling pain and how we can unlearn pain. And I think it was in GQ magazine, there was a really interesting article about George Clooney, who had some accidents, and he's suffered quite extensively chronic pain, and how he trained his brain to actually not suffer from it so much. So that's an alternative example. You might think, well, the book on learning, I want books on study techniques and so forth. Well, I'm mentioning this precisely because if you have pain and you have negative pain leading you away from success, well, then you need to learn your way out of it. This is going to be a great guide for that. And you won't have to do what I did, as I reported in The Victorious Mind, which is memorize 1,700 plus words of Sanskrit. Although, if you did want to do that, I think you'll find it a very worthy adventure indeed, because my experience machine is so much better these days, and I'm grateful for that. Now, another person who can take you into a different kind of experience machine that's related is Scott Young's Ultralearning. I really like this book, and our standout quote shows the link to the experience machine very, very quickly. Scott Young says, when you see yourself as lacking the potential to be good at something, or believe that you'll always be behind everyone else, no matter how hard you work, it robs you of the motivation to work hard. Now, this book is not just mindset stuff. It's actually practical applications based on some of the learning projects that Scott Young took himself on. And, it's everything from passing MIT exams to learning to draw, learning languages, and so forth. He has a funny joke about guys like me who love memory techniques that you won't want to miss. And I still laugh every time that I think about it. But it's a really, really good guide. I think his follow-up book is even better. But this one, if you want to know my 2 cents on the matter, is where to start. And of course, Scott Young's blog is fantastic as well. And there's many things that he does to dive into learning projects in the same sense that Adam Gopnik does in the real work. And Scott does the real work. So you'll find that inspiring, and he does it in more than one field. So this book, Ultralearning, gives you a lot of the nuts and bolts of what he's doing, why he's doing it, and just don't miss it. Absolutely fantastic. I'll never forget the time on one of my books, someone said that I was the Bruce Lee of memory. That's a big compliment. I don't know that it's deserved, but I understand why the person said that. And I had read Striking Thoughts, and I think it's a great book on the mindset of learning. And also, when it comes to just framing your mind and directing your inner power, your outer power at the game of learning, coming back to learning, getting beat up, falling off the horse, needing to get yourself back up on the horse, you need striking thoughts, and you need those strikes to land. So I highly recommend this book by Bruce Lee, It's one that I dip into over and over and over again, and I always find something new, some thought-correcting idea. I don't agree with everything Bruce Lee says. In fact, there's a lot to disagree with what he says, because some of it is a little bit thin sometimes, but nonetheless, it's just good to disagree with your teacher sometimes, or the author of the book that you're reading. And by disagreeing, we often arrive at new understandings. So you can strike back, is basically what I'm saying. The standout quote here is, if you learn concepts, if you work for information, then you don't understand. You can only explain. I don't know exactly what Bruce Lee means by if you only work for information. But that's a very, very interesting concept, right? Like, what would you do that wasn't working for information? Perhaps part of it is giving yourself time off to percolate. And that leads us to one of the next books where you have some strategies for percolation. If I was doing a standard top 10 list, this would probably be number 1, Learning How to Learn by Barbara Oakley. And she talks about how you can learn while not working, and that has to do with percolation, or the term she uses is diffuse thinking. So what is that? That's taking time off to let your brain rest. So you study, you don't cram, and then you take time off and you just let your brain sift and sort and screen the information. That can sound risky to students who really need to pass an exam, but I've seen it work time and time again. And we have many, many studies, more studies than anyone has time to read, about this kind of phenomenon where if we just leave ourselves alone, we'll have these aha moments and things will just start to connect. But it's not totally devoted to, hey, just study for 15 minutes and then go have fun. No, there's more strategy to that. Speed reading is a big problem in the world, or at least it used to be. I don't hear about it that much anymore. But a lot of people used to be, I have to. Actually, I did hear about it yesterday in an email. Someone was like, so-and-so reads 500 words a minute. I want to do that too. Really? It doesn't matter how fast you read? I'm not sure. What matters is how well you read. And in any case, when it comes to reading well, she has some priming tips here, one of which is the picture walk, and I really like how she puts that together. Oh, I should mention, it's not just Barbara Oakley alone, but Terry Sianowski is here, and as well as the co-author, and this is a really good book. It has memory techniques in it, and one of the things that you might notice is that it's a guide for kids and teens, but it's really for adults. I can't think of an adult who wouldn't benefit from this. So don't let the subtitle talk you out of it, because it's really, really good. And I really do think it would be my number 1 if I was doing a standard top 10 list. Here, the standout quote is wonderful. Practice and repeat little chunks of learning over the course of several days. This will create the neural patterns that underlie your gradually growing expertise. The more difficult the little chunks are to learn, and the more deeply you learn them, the more rapidly your expertise will grow. This is such an important point. And chunking is a memory strategy, breaking things down. And the more difficult they are, the more you can break them down. I'll give you a simple example. There are sometimes phrases in languages or lines in poetry where I'll stumble a little bit, and I'll break it down to just one syllable in a word. I did that with my 1,700 words of Sanskrit plus. And there's lots and lots of times where I have worked on just one little syllable on a day. But it's tortoise versus the hare. And so that slowing down to really focus on the difficult part didn't stop me from actually beating the hare in the end. I went faster as a result of using chunking strategies and breaking things down. So that's a beautiful quote that you'll experience yourself if you allow yourself to do it. Don't miss the book, Learning How to Learn. When it comes to memory improvement books, I've always felt that the absolute best instructional manuals are ones that focus on a particular outcome. Because there are a lot of memory technique books for studying. There's all kinds of memory techniques books for general memory and so forth. But even if they're focused on student outcomes like exams, they're still so general. They're not exams on biology, for example. And, I wish I had all the time in the world to learn all those topics and really dive into manuals just for them. But at the same time, there is the possibility of learning memory techniques generally and working out on your own how they apply to different topic areas. And it is true that if you would just master the 5 main mnemonic systems, such as those that I teach in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass, you will be able to figure out how it applies to your information. But I still think when it comes to books, the best are those ones that are focused specifically on certain outcomes. And that's what almost all of my memory books are that I can think of. But one that I wanted to share with you today is one I've never talked about before in any detail, which is Memorize the Stoics by Kevin Vost. And it is very, very focused on how you apply the art of memory, memory palaces, and other techniques to memorizing Stoic wisdom, the bullet points, the specific quotes, and really absorbing them in such a way that you can enjoy the fruits of Stoicism in your life. Now, I'm not a Stoic myself. I often think of Nietzsche's joke, which I am paraphrasing many different parts of Nietzsche and his comments on Stoicism. But basically, it's like they believe in God, they believe in time, and there's more than one of them, which I always think is funny. But that said, one of my favorite quotes that I ever memorized in Latin, I learned in Memorize the Stoics, which is, Nihil minus est omnes occupati quam vi veri, which is Seneca. And he's basically saying we busy ourselves with the busy stuff of life. The implication being focus on the fundamentals so that you can actually get the fullest possible riches of life. And so I think that this book is absolutely fantastic. It introduces you to the art of memory in a way that our next author puts a whole lot more nuance on. And it's not that it's necessarily incorrect, but, you know, I'm not going to complain about this. Unfortunately, Kevin Vost left us. I feel really badly that I never did interview him, even though I was asked to. The person who sent me the Kevin Vost book asked me to interview him. He even put a picture of Giordano Bruno on the envelope to help inspire me to interview Kevin Vost. And unfortunately, between the time that the book was sent to me very graciously and that it arrived to me, Kevin Vost had entered the Great Memory Palace in the Sky, joining Tony Buzan. So I really regret that I never did that. In any case, the only thing about this book that I would just caution people around is that there are memory palaces provided for you. And if you struggle with that, it's because you get an additional cognitive load when you're trying to use a supplied memory palace as opposed to one that you develop yourself based on your memory, because that's what a memory palace is, what's in your memory. But if you're learning someone else's memory palace, then you're effectively building a memorized palace. Now, your mileage may vary, and that may be the case that it just works wonderfully for you. But in my 15 years of teaching this full time, I have found that most people that I've worked with, again, it's just the people I've worked with, they struggle to memorize memory palaces, and it just makes sense, because why would you memorize a location and add that additional cognitive load when you can just simply use your own? That said, if you do work well with example memory palaces, there's interesting ones in here for you to work with. Now for the standout quote from Memorize the Stoics. Viewed from a Stoic perspective, such memory methods could entail a revised impression of our own memory capacities, moving them from what we might have considered outside of our control to something within our control, for some, to a surprising extent. And that's why I go on that little mini speech about the difference between real memory palaces and memorized palaces, because I do want you to be surprised if you're new to using such techniques and not overwhelmed by having to learn a memory palace. But in any case, this is a book that I highly recommend you explore. Now, I mentioned Vost and the history of memory techniques. One of the people who has brought the most nuance that I'm aware of is Lynn Kelly, and I know people are having a hard time finding the Knowledge Gene, but I'm not going to let that stop me from recommending it. And maybe you can press on the publisher to get it released in the United States or wherever it's not available at the moment, because this is incredible, as is Lynn Kelly's work overall. So if you haven't read The Memory Code and you haven't read Memory Craft and you just don't follow her blog, etc., get on it, because this is great. And so Lynn has gone through indigenous and prehistoric memory techniques, how Stonehenge was used and so forth in some of her previous books. And now she's taking us inside of genetics. And it's a great proof of concept because she learned all about genetics using memory techniques in order to put this book together. And then you just have an extraordinary understanding of how our culture works with information, how that we sometimes seem to just throw stuff away that's seemingly so valuable, and yet it all sort of makes sense in the end in order to compress or to consolidate our knowledge. And you may see yourself in some of the ways that older cultures have operated. Or you might see the way that information is being treated in our time with flourishing data on the internet and some of its strangeness. You just might think about it in a different context as you think about the role of genetics in learning. The standout quote here is amazing. Oral traditions the world over link knowledge to streams, rivers, rocks, lakes, cliffs, hills, trees, and other features in their natural memory palaces. The songs, stories, and associated knowledge are recalled whenever the landscape is walked, either in reality or in imagination. I love that because it really gets to how that we have so many resources around us that we could turn into memory palaces. And yet, how often do we get hung up on, oh, well, I can only use my apartment or something like that, when you could actually, if you follow Lynn Kelly's work to the nth degree, you can use your hand as a memory palace, you can use a walking stick as a memory palace, and I've heard from some of you that you have put some of those ideas into action, and they're amazing what happens. In fact, in this book, Vitamin X, some of those techniques, like the hand memory palace, come into play as Detective Williams tries to save his brain and his memory inside of his brain, and that is inspiration coming directly out of Lynn Kelly's work, but also Tyson Yunkaporta, who there's only a little bit of memory in Sandtalk, but that's also a good book worth reading in order to broaden your perspective about what memory techniques are, how they can be used in learning for different outcomes, like meetings is one of the things that Tyson Yunkaporta talks about the hand memory palace technique for. And yeah, there's just so much in that realm that is just never unpacked by anybody else except for Lynn Kelly and Tyson Yunkaporta as well. So get on that stuff because there's so many different ways to use space. As Thales said in ancient Greek, and forgive my pronunciation if it's not perfect because I don't know ancient Greek, but I just memorized this. What was it? Megaston topos hapantagar kori. Space is ultimate because it contains all things. And that is interesting because in the knowledge gene, you explore the space within and learn more about how your little bits and pieces help you learn or get in the way, as it sometimes unfortunately happens. I love this quote. Playing guitar won't increase how many babies I have, nor will it make them healthier. But maybe, just maybe, the art of reinvention and acquiring new skills can give us a sense of a life well lived. That's from Gary Marcus, the author of Guitar Zero. A lot of people ask me about music, especially because they see that I play music. And learning it and memorizing it. This is a great deep dive into the cognitive processing that's involved in learning music. It's about the barriers that people have. We talked earlier about the experience machine and how sometimes our predictions come true just simply because the brain learns from its own content. And if you think in certain ways that you could never learn an instrument, well, then you might be right. But here, Marcus goes against the objections and he figures out how to make it work. And although, he doesn't necessarily fill stadiums in the end, he's right, at least in my experience, having toured and just explored so many things about music and knowing how much mindset is important to being able to learn music quickly. It's just as important as any sort of learning technique. This is going to give you a completely different way to think about what music is, what is involved in learning it, and how to get yourself into the game if you're not already in it. And if you are already in it, you might gain some insight into the other people that you encounter who have struggles that you don't, etc. So it's a great book on the learning of music that's very immersive because of its story-based nature, but he's just a great expert in a lot of things that have to do with computation, AI, etc. And here he's applied it to the guitar. So yeah, make sure to give Guitar Zero a look, because he's absolutely right. There's so much of life that you can live at a much higher level by simply becoming musically knowledgeable. So I have so many other books that I could talk about, and I have more that I want to share with you in my content upgrade for this video. So if you are interested, go to magneticmarymethod.com/LBQ, which stands for Learning Book Quiz. And that quiz is going to help you go through the additional books that I have on my list, select them better, and at the very end of that resource, I give you an additional tip. It's very simple, but it's very, very powerful for making sure that you never run out of the absolute most appropriate books for you that will help you to continue learning. I've used that tip for years, and it's been fantastic. So thanks again for hitting that thumbs up, for getting subscribed, and one more tip that I think will really set you on a fantastic path for learning. And that is, if you don't follow up on videos that you read by getting the physical books, going to the sources that people use, you are starving yourself of something that's called the levels of processing effect. So I love learning from video. I love listening to podcasts, but without triangulating it with actually reading and then writing about what I've read, then or watched on video, etc., it's just leaving a part of the brain unaccessed. This was part of Tony Buzan's point in Mind Map Mastery. So take notes physically with your hand, but take notes from a variety of media so that your brain can triangulate everything. And then if you want to memorize the notes that you wrote down as you triangulate or quadrupulate or whatever, octaviate, you are going to be well served by watching my video on how to use the memory palace for studying next, because one of the best things that you can do is memorize these things, but in a way that comes from the foundation of having written it out by hand from a variety of mediums. And, if you need another book to add to the list after you go through the memory palace for studying, you can always read one of my books on the memory palace if you're so inclined. Maybe The Victorious Mind, especially if you are interested in trying to stop your thoughts, which is what got me into the topic of that book, which is language learning, so that I could memorize Sanskrit to reach that goal. But I needed to study what the instructions were using the memory palace technique. So enjoy, and until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.